So we talked in episode 2 about defining crisis, and one of the key components we talked about in that is that crises are inherently made up of either one massive thing that has large implications, or a bunch of smaller things that are interconnected in entangled and complex ways, or even worse, a mixture of those things. So some big things, some small things. What that means is inherently, if you're trying to come up with an action plan of how do we deal with this, you can't come up with a silver bullet, you can't come up with a simple answer, so you're going to need to figure out a way to make sense of all of these different issues, all the implications of these different issues, and figure out how do we prioritize, what do we tackle first, next, and next. The challenge for organizational leaders is that we all interact with crises in very personal and individual ways, which means that setting priorities are going to be hugely important for the group, because on an individual basis, our own priorities might be different. So if you take the coronavirus crisis we're dealing with now, it's going to be different for each of us, because it might be that we're dealing with children who are not at school, so they're home with us, and how do we homeschool while going about our day-to-day work? It may be working from home and trying to get reacclimated to that. It may be that actually in our line of work or our business, we can't work from home and we're furloughed or we're taking a pay cut. Each of those is problematic in different ways, and so we're going to interact with that same crisis in very different ways. So organizational leaders need to figure out a way to bring people together to figure out what are the common priorities for all of us as we face this crisis. So the challenge for leadership, when everyone has these individual and possibly competing priorities, is about how do we bring everyone together and prioritize around a few big priorities that we can all agree on. And how you do that is getting back to what we talked about in episode 1, which is purpose, why is this organization here? And values, what are the values that are most important to this particular organization? And that allows you to sift through all of these individual aspects, all these individual challenges, and get everyone to pull together around a couple of core common things they can agree upon to help figure out what do we prioritize first in terms of dealing with this crisis effectively. In getting past these individual aspects and getting to a couple of core priorities, what that allows you to do is, one, as we talked about before in communication, have a clear and consistent message that everyone understands and is hearing over and over again, so it's dependable and reliable. And secondly, and this is hugely important in dealing with crises, is it allows your plan to be iterative. It allows you to start in one direction and make changes as you go along. And that's hugely important in crises because, as we talked about before, in crises, it's almost always the case that you either don't have all of the information or the information you're getting is constantly changing. So that means you're going to need to have an adaptive plan. Whatever you start out with probably isn't going to be what makes sense a day later, a week later, or a month later. By focusing on the purpose and the core values, that can stay consistent, and you can change the plan of action to bring you back to those things as the information changes and as you proceed in dealing with this particular crisis. So as you're developing your plan, you're going to start from the premise of we're trying to get back to our purpose and our core values. We know that this current plan may not be exactly what we go with. And the reasons it might change will be changes in information, changes in timeline, changes in outside pressures, changes in inside pressures. Now, fundamental to that is in a leadership position during crises, in particular, you're going to need to bring in different voices and different feedback. In other words, it is imperative that you have a wealth of data, a wealth of information, and a wealth of different perspectives during the crisis planning part. Otherwise, you're going to miss key information, you're going to miss changes that you need to be aware of, and you're going to miss new opportunities or new solutions because you don't have different perspectives having those discussions. So even though you're going to feel under tremendous stress to make decisions instantly, you want to spend actually more time on problem understanding so that when you come to your solutions, they're likely to be more impactful and more effective. So taken all together, that's going to ask leaders during crisis to do a few things. Firstly, they're going to need to be able to look at a whole bunch of different issues and establish some key priorities. Again, purpose and values. Make sense of the million different things that are going on and help people to understand them in a few simple ways that have been agreed upon in advance. Secondly, you're going to need to make sure you're bringing in different voices so that you have all the information available to you that's possible. That might mean bringing in people who traditionally haven't been part of these discussions or that have been left out, But you have to realize that in a crisis, you're going to need all the information you can get, and you're going to need to involve people in different ways in order to help you understand the situation that's going on and come up with the best range of solutions possible. And finally, while we love the idea of a decisive, definitive leader who's going to tell people what to do and they run off and do it, particularly in a crisis, you're going to need to empower people to give you feedback, because you'll need to keep updating yourself about what's changed or what hasn't changed. Does the timeline still make sense or not? What new information has emerged? What new people are involved that we didn't know about? So it's really important that you're not just telling people what to do, but you're also getting that feedback and encouraging people to actually give in more information, not less. So in total, the goal is to wind up with a clear set of priorities that everyone understands and that people feel like they can go out and action themselves. So again, leadership is distributed, but a very clear set of this is the purpose, these are the values, and this is why we're doing the things that we're doing to get back to that. It needs to be focused on information. How do we develop information? How do we track our progress? How do we check to see what's changing and what's not? And how do we communicate that to people when they need it, and not before, and certainly not too late? And finally, it's about a consistent message around purpose and values, but also being very clear from the beginning that whatever plan you put in place at the beginning is probably going to change, because that's the nature of dealing with crisis. As new information arises, as things change, you're going to need to be able to adapt your plan, and that's a fundamental part of leadership, to be able to say, we were going this direction, we've changed directions because this is the new information, and this is going to help us get to our core values or our purpose much more effectively, and we will, as we go along, constantly be changing as we need to in order to make sure we're as effective as possible. So that's coming up with a plan of attack to manage a crisis. What happens when you're managing a crisis is most of your plans tend to be on the immediate term or the short term. How do I get through this, to get through this, to get through this? Many of you who are dealing with crisis now in terms of coronavirus are thinking, how do I get through today? You're not thinking a week, a month, a year from now. You're just trying to get through payroll. You're just trying to communicate with your staff. You're just trying to literally get from hour to hour. What you have to make sure that you can do as a leader in an organization that's going through crisis, however, is to be able to, at regular intervals, take a step back and look at something at a much longer time period, on a bigger scale. Because what can happen in a crisis is we get our heads down and we get so focused on the day-to-day that we wind up making decisions that have very long-term impacts for us strategically. So you might be able to have a plan that helps you survive the crisis, but actually hamstrings you and keeps you from being successful when the crisis is actually over. So we'll talk more in the next episode about that strategic thinking. And really it's a mindset, but it's that building that strategic thinking into your planning. And it can be as simple as just making sure you're actually asking that question. But we'll talk more about that in the next one. Planning gets you through the crisis. You need to make sure that you don't lose sight of what comes after the crisis. I hope this episode is useful for you as you manage your own crises, particularly now in times of coronavirus. If you have questions or comments, please leave feedback below. I'm looking forward to it.